The Luminato Festival in Toronto, it's Toronto's festival, international festival essentially it's an international cultural festival of creativity, of adventure, of discovery. And it's been going 10 years. And in 2016, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the festival, and we celebrated it with a festival completely unlike any of the other 9. And I'm going to say a little bit about what we did, about why we did it, about how we did it, and about where that led the festival now. And these are images of the first 9 years. The Luminato Festival was founded in a rather unusual way. A lot of festivals have grown over time. They have long periods of gestation and growth. Edinburgh Festival's been going, say, 70 years. The Luminato Festival was formed much more suddenly. It came out of the back end of the SARS epidemic in Toronto, when Toronto was in a very troubled and challenged state. And so it came into being very suddenly. It was supported by a large investment from the provincial government. It was also supported by a lot of donations from a group of founding luminaries, people who, so unusually, it started at a very high level rather than building over time. It had 2 real foundations. One of them was city building, sort of inevitably, given the circumstances of its birth. And the second was to bring an international dimension, to expand the international offer in Toronto, and to create a lot of new international relationships for the cultural scene in Toronto. Financially, as I say, it started with those 2 unusual foundations. And the artistic policy of it from the start was always to focus on commissions and premieres and new work. So there was something like 100, just over 100 commissions and premieres have happened in the festival's first 10 years. The partnerships have always been an important part of the festival's life. A little bit less in the last half of the first decade. Very important at the beginning, and will be coming back in the second decade. And the third really important element of the festival has always been exploring the city, giving people a fresh sense of their city, presenting work in outdoor spaces, in found spaces, in unfamiliar spaces, and giving people a sense of a fresh view on their city. I arrived to the festival just over 15 months ago, in the summer of 15, so just about a year before we were going to celebrate the 10th anniversary. And we started planning a festival, a 10th anniversary festival, essentially like the previous 9, spread around the city in a variety of venues, indoors and outdoors, a variety of partnerships supporting those venues. But we wanted to do something at the same time as that. We wanted to do something much fresher. The previous project I was doing in Gateshead, I left it just after celebrating its 10th anniversary. There is something about 10th anniversaries. It's just the point when initial energy can be beginning to flag a little bit. And we wanted for Luminato absolutely to recapture that, to re-energize it, to give it a fresh sense of a place at the center of Toronto's life. So we were looking at how we would combine those 2 things together. In 2014, we'd opened up a building in Toronto that was, and it's an extraordinary, like an industrial cathedral, this. It's a disused electricity generating station. You can see there it sits in a sort of industrial zone, actually close to the downtown of Toronto, but a little bit aside from it, a side that very few people in Toronto really know well. And it was opened in 1951. It ran for 30 years as a power station, then it closed. Then in 2002, it was leased to a company called Studios of America to make there was an enormous project to turn it into a colossal film studio. That didn't work. That was abandoned in 2006. So for the last 10 years, it's been completely closed to the public. It's just been used for film shoots. Almost every sort of dystopian urban film you have ever seen that has a mysterious climax in a building you don't recognize with people in whom you're not interested killing each other was probably very likely shot in that building. Minority Report, Suicide Squad, so on, so on, so on. And for the last 10 years, it's had no public access, of course, nor did it before that when it was a power station. So in 2014, Luminato took its fundraising gala into this building. And it was a completely seismic moment. It was, I would think, 1% of the people in that picture and the gala had ever set foot in this building before. It was a completely extraordinary experience. And you get a sense, if you look above, I'm going to come back to this business, oh, sorry, I'm going to come back to this business of safety in a sec. But if you look above, you'll see a whole load of sort of bits of metal hanging over people's heads. You have no sense of whether they're actually safe or whether they aren't. And people I'll come back to that too, people talked about this for the whole of the rest of the festival. 2014. So in 2015, we took the gala back again, but we also took one piece of programming into this extraordinary building. We took the Unsound Festival, which a lot of you, I'm sure most of you will know from Krakow in Poland. It calls itself a festival of electronic and experimental music. It's really a celebration of contemporary culture. That's really what it is. And critically for Luminato, what it did was it connected Luminato with a public, a younger public, a demographically much broader and much more lively public, a public who hadn't been on Luminato's map at all before. Partly the festival, but partly the building. It was the sense of the excitement of going to see what could be done in this building. So it was 2015. So then I arrived in the summer of 2015, so we started to think, 2016, as I said, we began to plan in a conventional way. And then there came one of those extraordinary moments in the autumn, in October, so like 8 months before the festival, when the then artistic director, Jörn Breisbrot, whose last festival we knew by then this was to be, came into the office. We looked at all the plans in a sort of slightly intemperate way. These aren't exciting enough. These are not the stuff of a 10th anniversary. We can do better than this. And in one of those sudden moments, it took him like 10 seconds to say it, he said, we should move the entire festival into the Herne Generating Station. Plays, music, dance, visual arts, restaurants, everything. So we did. So we did that. We had 10 months to plan it, and the first thing we did was build a variety of separate spaces in the Herne. I'll say a little bit more about how that worked in a second. But so this was, I was going to call it a conventional theatre space. I mean, in a way, it's anything but conventional. It was where the National Theatre of Scotland did their magnificent 9-hour cycle of the James plays. About the only thing conventional about it is it's got a stage and it's got an auditorium. Everything else about it was unfamiliar and extraordinary. Then we created another stage for music and for dance, and you'll see that there are no walls here. I'm going to come back to that in a second too. And you'll also see above, again, all these things hanging above the audience at every stage. We did a variety of music events in there. That's Tafel Music, a Baroque orchestra, Rufus Does Judy, a monumental, fantastic dance project, and we brought Unsound back again for a second year. Then we brought Rimini Protocol and these are all projects which until October in the year before the festival, I'd say 8 months to go, every one of these had a home in a different part of Toronto. So these were all just suddenly gathered together in this building. We brought Rimini Protocol from Germany, who did Situation Rooms, one of their wonderful pieces of immersive theatre, which again we installed in the space. Then we started to look around the building, and we started to think what kind of crazy things could we do with different bits of the building. And we came across, in the outside, there was beautiful parkland. There was sort of, it was rough land, but it had grown very beautifully with wildflowers, with all the sort of things you would find in this sort of environment. And the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, had acquired this remarkable piece by Pierre Huy, which is a concrete, the main sculpture is concrete, but her head has been replaced by a live colony of bees. The Ontario Gallery had never been able to show that because it's not easy to show live bees in a gallery. So we gave them what the sculptor reckoned was actually the best place it had ever been seen. We also brought back Michel de Bruyne's wonderful 1,000 Speculations, which in a way is a conventional mirror ball. At least you think it's a conventional mirror ball until you see it close to, and then you realize it's 8 meters across. And it shot shafts of light all over the building. So all over the building, you had these shafts of light moving around all the time, animating the building. Then we found, this was the control room. This was the main control room of the power station when it was a power station. So what would you do with a control room in a power station? Well, of course, you would turn it into a restaurant. So this was done with Fred Morin of Montreal and John Bill of Toronto, a very high-end restaurant entirely installed in that control room. And then we put a beer garden outside, so there was a decent variety of catering for the wider public. Beautiful garden with views over the lake. And then the pictures I'm going to run now is a sequence of pictures from the festival. Say a little bit about the thing. First of all, I'll say a little bit about the things that worked, and then I'll say about the things which didn't quite work and why, and the lessons we drew from it. The absolutely key thing that worked was because the building was completely unfamiliar to virtually everybody who came into it. It became an attraction in itself. And so we drew to 15th century Scottish drama, to performances by the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, to all the art that we did during the festival. We drew a public who'd come partly for the building. So they were partly just excited to be in the space. We also, the festival in all its previous years, had what I would call a nomadic existence. In a way, that's not quite right, but it had had an existence dispersed around the city, sometimes in venues quite far apart. And the difficulty with that, always, anybody who runs festivals will know, is creating a single sense of community out of that for the audience. And what this, working in this building did, was it gave us a sense of a single community of the festival and a sense of a campus. And we brought people together in extraordinary combinations to see, things you would never expect to see the same audience seeing the same piece of work. We also were able to completely reinvent the way we dealt with our front of house and customer relations. Because the public, this wasn't a conventional art space, the public had no idea what to expect. They knew they weren't coming to a conventional theatre, but they didn't know much more. We were able to create a front of house language and a presentational language and a customer service language that was completely of its own and for this building. And there were challenges with that, but the good thing was the public, it was all part of the public experiencing the building as a completely unfamiliar kind of experience. Because the building was the scale that it was, there was actually more space than we could use for the festival. So we then invited 20 arts organizations in Toronto to join us as arts partners for the festival. And these were people who typically brought things quite different to what was in the rest of the festival. So Yes, Yes, You're All, a queer underground hip-hop dance club. There was a parkour group. And also, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra came and did a special concert of Gershwin and Beethoven in there. And what that did was further and further and further push the envelope of the communities who were engaging with the festival. So each one of those arts partners brought publics of their own that were unknown to us, unfamiliar to us, and became part of the family of the festival. Another obvious benefit was just the physical impact of this. It made an enormous impact on the media internationally as well as in Canada. And there were, obviously you understand the benefits that come from that. And the last benefit, I would say, is the festival's never previously sold all its own tickets. We sold previously a lot of tickets through other venues, partner venues. Selling all our own tickets for this meant that in 10 years, for the first time, the festival had a complete data set of all its public. And we'd never had that before, and that's of enormous value, as you can imagine. Challenges in this, of course, only having 8 months to plan is a challenge, something as complex as this. Though there is also something very liberating about it. I've done a couple of festivals before which had much less planning time than they should have had, the Cultural Olympiad in London in 2012 and a big BBC festival in the Millennium. And there is something very liberating about going into a meeting and knowing you have to come out with a decision, not being able to say, we'll come back to this tomorrow. There's something very powerful about just having a completely insane and impossible timescale to which you have to keep. I mentioned this earlier, but we took a decision not to build any walls in this building. And the good side of that was that you had a subliminal awareness of all the different things happening in the building. So you might see one thing over here, but you would vaguely be aware of something else happening at the other end of the building. The complicated side of that was that no two noise-producing things could happen simultaneously. So that was I think it was the right decision, but it gave us quite a scheduling complexity. We had a couple of challenges with the City Council. I know one or two people from Toronto City Council are here. I just want to say this sort of carefully. And they were enormously supportive in all kinds of ways. But in the first 2 years, they'd regulated us like an outdoor festival. This year, because we were in this building for 17 years, they regulated us like a building. It's more complex, more onerous, and you can imagine that. And also, there were quite a lot of in-kind things that we had talked to the city about providing, and they turned out in the end to be difficult to do. And that was because a lot of those things we discovered quite late. There were challenges in that for us. I mentioned this business. I mean, there you can see more of them at the top, the bits of metal hanging down. The sort of frisson of danger for the public was mainly fine. But there were some members of the public for whom the whole business of the experience was kind of dangerous and frightening and intimidating and dirty and threatening and all of that. And there were a couple of people who said to me rather irritably, "We'll reconnect with the festival when you come back to the mainland." That extended slightly to the contractors. There were one or two contractors who worked with us who were anxious about the safety in the building. We had an absolutely scrupulous health and safety regime. We were very proud of it. We had no accidents in the thing at all. But there were one or two contractors for whom this seemed an alarming place to work. And we hadn't expected that, I have to say. Transport, I mean, whenever you do a project like this in a sort of like a location like this, there's a transport issue. We had huge car parks. We had a shuttle bus. It was easily cyclable. We did a wonderful sponsorship deal with Car2Go. But there were still people for whom, and particularly some of the older, more traditional people, for whom this was a really problematic journey. And the whole, all of that sort of added to their sense that this was an alarming and dangerous experience. And the last thing I should say about the challenges in this was, obviously, it gives us a challenge for 2017, because we're not going to go back and do this again. This was a one-off 10th anniversary special thing. It was designed as a one-off thing. We were really clear we weren't going to repeat it. And I'll say a little bit more when I absolutely finish about what we're going to do about that in 2017. But having said all of that, at the end of the day, we made more earned income from this festival than we've ever made in the history of the festival. We got more, discounting those early founding luminaries, we got more in individual giving. We got the biggest single donation the festival's ever had. And two very good figures that are about renewal. 40% of our corporate partners this year were engaging with us for the first time. And 35% of all the individual givers were people who were either new or we'd recaptured them. They'd been floating away a little bit towards the end of the first decade when some of the initial energy had maybe run down a little bit. It had an enormously galvanic effect on bringing in new partners and bringing back previous partners. Tourism figures were up 25% or so. The tourism spend was up. And our website views were 55% higher than the previous year. So the kind of web presence of this was absolutely enormous. But the most important thing, I think, wasn't any of those. The most important thing was, and people who've run projects which reach 10-year milestones will know this, there is a very sort of natural sense that there's an exciting launch, everyone's thrilled with something, whatever it is, whether it's a building or a festival or orchestra or an opera company, when things are new, there's a huge excitement that brings in donors, that brings in sponsors and supporters, that brings in audiences, because it's new. And the 10-year mark is often the point when that's beginning to flag a little bit. And what this really did more than anything else, in a kind of crazy, ridiculous, impractical, expensive way. I mean, everything you do in this building, you have to add a couple of zeros financially to anywhere else, simply because of its absolutely ridiculous scale. But the result of this was repositioning the festival in the minds of our audiences, all the audiences who either had been with us at the start and drifted off a little bit, or people who'd thought of Luminato as being an establishment festival that wasn't maybe for them. And there was a sense of energy about this that was completely different from the immediate past festivals. And I just decided to finish with saying a little bit about 2017, because we have in a way, this was a second chance for the festival to make a first impression, if you like. One of those things that you imagine never happens, but it does sometimes happen. And in a way, we have the same thing in 2017, because the new artistic director of the festival, I said this was the last festival of the previous artistic director. The new artistic director, Josephine Ridge from Melbourne, who's here this week, the absolutely sensational gain, not just for the festival, but for the city of Toronto, bringing in a huge raft of fresh ideas, which will look nothing like this, which will not be in the Hearn, which will be expressed in a completely different way, picking up some of the lessons and benefits from this, but otherwise completely different. what these two festivals together will do, I think, in looking at it in the long term, looking 10, 15, 20 years ahead for this festival, because like all the major festivals in the world, like Edinburgh, I envisage a long, long, long developmental life for this festival. What these two festivals will do, this 10th anniversary and the one we will announce in the spring for next year, is completely reposition the way the city thinks about the festival. Thank you very much.